are desperate as teachers, especially this year more than ever, to see our students' reading achievement accelerate. And we want to assess our kids and get as much information about them as we can so that we know how to teach them. But a common issue in our teaching culture is that we are assessing kids using reading levels, and then we're trying to make instructional decisions based on that. And that turns out to be a really hard trick. Reading levels are useful for sure, but they actually don't tell us as much information about our students as we think. So we're going to be talking about some of the weaknesses of the reading levels and why this diagram can help us understand where the faults are in reading levels. So reading levels, that's our topic for tonight. What are the problems with them and what are the solutions? So I want to make the point tonight about the weaknesses of reading levels as a way of figuring out where our students are and how to know what to do with them. I've used this analogy before. It's kind of like a doctor taking our temperature. The doctor can take our temperature and just say, yes, you are sick. But the doctor doesn't know what to do with that information alone, right? It could be that the person has a fever because of the flu, or it could be because of COVID. It could be because of an ear infection. It could be because of an autoimmune disorder. It could be because of strep. There are probably many, many more sicknesses that a fever and a high temperature could point us to. And so I want you to use that, think about that as a metaphor for reading level. For most kids who are developing readers, when we know their reading level, particularly if they're developing, beginning, or struggling, that's like yes or no, they're on grade level, yes or no. Okay, that's helpful. That tells us, do we have a problem or not? Is there a fever or not? So the temperature taking is kind of like that big picture question, answering yes or no, sick or not sick. The reading level or the overall reading comprehension test, it tells us the student is on track or not on track. But then what do we do with that information? Have you run into this problem? I found this to be the first problem that I encountered as a middle school language arts teacher. I had students test at the end of this grade year, coming into the beginning of my 6th grade class. I knew whether they were a 4, a 3, a 2, or a 1. But what do I do for the kids who are a 3? What do I do instructionally for those who are a 2? And how is that different than what I would do for the students who are a 1? The measure is just a measure of a problem or not a problem. It's not really telling us what to do about it. Reading levels are really important, but they're inadequate. And I want to use this diagram again to point out why. A reading level is, in broad terms, giving us a measure of their comprehension. That's like the peak of this triangle. That's the outcome. That's the answer to the question, sick or not sick. And it's super important that we know how our students are doing on the ultimate goal of reading. But it's beneath that triangle, the pinnacle of the triangle, that tells us what to teach. And that in this pinnacle, this triangle, tells us the developmental progression that most kids go through and that we need to guide them through to develop to the point where there's strong comprehension. They can't be strong in comprehension if that foundation of sound-based decoding is weak. They can't be good in comprehension if they can maybe decode, but they don't recognize any words. They have poor word identification. And even if they recognize a lot of words, but they can't read them automatically, and they don't put the words together in a fluent manner with good intonation and phrasing, they're probably weak in fluency, and it'll affect their comprehension. So the reading level is giving us that upper part of the triangle, important, but inadequate to tell us what to do. Same thing with a reading comprehension measure. So that is why I bring this triangle up. It's an interactive triangle. All of these pieces work together, but In general, they operate developmentally in this hierarchy, and the foundation is the word sound-based decoding, when that is the part of our schooling that is generally not so strong. Okay, so what is wrong with reading levels and what can we do about it? First of all, reading levels don't tell you what to teach. What's the difference between an I level reader and an H level reader? You can make up some things about text types, but really on that triangle, it doesn't tell you what to do specifically. So that's one big problem. The other big problem is just with the reading levels themselves. I'm sorry to say, but this may be a shock because so many people are just using reading levels as such an important measure and also think that the reading levels are really valid and really tell you something. But have you noticed that sometimes a student tests on, say, Monday with a D, and sometimes, if you happen to test them again, even that week, they're suddenly on an F. Maybe they read really well on one passage and they had an off day, and there's a big change in their reading level according to the assessment, but you didn't really see any change in their skill. It's just a reflection of the type of text. Maybe the student was reading about snow and he knew a lot about snow. Maybe the student was reading about hockey and he didn't know about hockey, and so he suddenly did poorer. So reading levels are not as valid as representing a true construct, particularly in the early grade levels. And then again, they don't tell us what to teach. So here is a study from the Reading Research Quarterly by Dr. Jim Cunningham and his colleagues. And what they did was examine 80 different texts that were leveled for reading recovery. And reading recovery was one of them, if not the main force behind leveled books. They certainly are one of the main movers in that field, and a lot of people, especially Fountas and Pinnell, their system have been based on the reading recovery leveling system. And yet there are some issues with those reading recovery measures. Okay, and here is one thing that this study found of using 80 different texts. The results of this study warn us about the practice of schools and school districts where primary grade children's oral reading is assessed using reading recovery books or passages. Because those assessments typically yield a reading level based on the reading recovery level of the books or passages used, they may not be valid for students whose teachers have emphasized word recognition or decoding rather than or more than the use of the three main cueing systems. So they were acknowledging that reading recovery is based on the concept of the three main cueing systems, which we have increasingly debunked, and many of us are moving towards emphasizing decoding and word recognition in the early grades. And yet these level texts, they don't line up to that approach to instruction. And how they broke it down into many different ways. And if you want to look at that, we could link you to that study. But this is one of the comments there. They said, moreover, the way reading recovery books are leveled provides no support for instruction in recognizing words by their orthography or their spelling or their system, or decoding them by their phonology. So looking at spelling structures like orthography or looking at phonology, that is not a systematic leveling within the reading recovery text. We recommend that advocates of word recognition or decoding instruction either seek out other kinds of materials or select and re-level a subset of reading recovery books that will provide increasing word level demands on the assigned levels of the books. As the assigned levels of the books increase. So what they're saying is that the levels don't really reflect developing word recognition skills, and that even though in that model that we saw earlier, word recognition is built upon sound-based decoding, and that's what builds up fluency and that's what builds up comprehension. But if the levels don't align with that type of development, it's really hard for us to know as teachers what to teach. Are you following this? This is just one perspective on why reading levels don't really help us, at least on their own, to guide instruction. It may be helpful barometer Just like if you have a sick patient, they have a fever, that's definitely helpful to know. It just doesn't tell you what to do, what medicines they may need to take. And similarly, the reading level is maybe useful, maybe more useful for some than others, but we need to dive in more deeply. And if we think about that triangle I showed earlier, we need to think about what's at the foundation. Is the foundation of that triangle shored up? Do they have strong sound-based decoding? And if not, that's what we need to address. Oh, and right, this is a real issue. I think that leveling took on a life of its own, and many of us thought that you are an M, or you are a C, or a T, and we aren't our reading level, and our children aren't their reading level, right? And I think even Fountas of Pinnell came out and said it's not really something that children need to know about. It's not something that they should be restricted to, even a reading range. It's just an instructional tool. But the levels themselves have some significant weaknesses in reliability and also, as I mentioned earlier, telling us what to teach specifically. So just checking your comments. Jennifer said before, Marnie, I used to use the DRA to assess her kids' reading levels. They don't tell you what the students need to learn, nor are they very accurate. Yeah, if you've done a lot of these tests, you see, oh, this is different. What this student got as a result is different than what I'm seeing day to day. So teachers are often telling me about the inconsistencies they see when they're in the midst of working with students. It was just a number to put on a data sheet for the higher powers to see growth. You can measure growth with them, but it's just a real gross metric in the sense of, I don't mean ugly, I mean like global, not very precise and specific. Yeah, Sarah, that's a good point. That study is from 2005, and yet we're still on the same, with the same traditions of emphasizing the leveled text as the way to group our students and the way to decide what to teach them. So it is a weakness. So what we're saying instead of assessing by reading level is, what if you assess by reading sub-skill? And this also resonates with the research of Carol Connor. She used like 3 different measures in a series of studies to assess what kids need. And even in first grade, some kids needed more decoding and some kids needed more meaning-based instruction. And when they were better matched based on a composite of reading skills, then they saw greater growth. So her research track in the last decade or so was about matching instructional needs of the student through assessment. And it wasn't just coming up with one reading level. It was decoding, vocabulary, comprehension. It was more complex. What we recommend here, again, is not to group by reading levels, particularly for kindergarten through second grade readers, unless they're way above grade level, or for struggling readers of any age. Because the reading level, again, it's not that valid, and it really doesn't tell us what to do. Similarly, don't group by high frequency words either. Again, it doesn't tell you much. Are they doing well with their sound-based decoding? That's really helpful to know and to find out. This is a different way of assessing. Now, many of you here, I know, are assessing this way, but what if you haven't thought about, if it's anyone here today not assessing that way, you are assessing by reading level, and then you're trying to make groups? Let us know, and we can try to talk it out and see if we persuaded you, or if there's issues, then let us know. Yes, it's so true, that principle that we need to not think of our children as just representing a level. How many of us were teachers when Harry Potter came out? It's still big, but it was nothing like the excitement of Harry Potter in those first 5 to 10 years in the culture. You would have first graders, second graders, third graders just so excited to read it. They weren't able to read it based on their reading level, but they actually were able to read it because their motivation was sky high. And if they were willing and able, then they probably benefited quite a bit by reading that Harry Potter. That's not to say that I don't want to know that information, what their level is as a teacher. If my student is frustrated and they keep reading a book up here, but I know that they're functioning down here, I'm going to help them try to think about other opportunities, but I'm not going to squash them all the time, particularly if they're not frustrated with the book that they're using. Gemma, I hated reading until I discovered Harry Potter. I bet there are a lot of people that could say the same thing. Great to hear that. Deborah is asking, are you saying grouping by standard or skill instead of letter? What assessments do you suggest? Okay, so think back to that original model of the triangle with comprehension at the top. Fluency is what comes before that. Word identification is what comes before that. And sound-based decoding is what comes before that. So we need to work our way up from the bottom. If we don't know for sure how our sound-based decoding is, then we do a measure or two to figure out if that's strong. One that I really like is a nonsense word or a word attack test. In other words, if you give a student a list of words that they've never seen that aren't real, then you see how their sound-based decoding is functioning. And that is a really strong principle from research that when kids are weak at reading, if they're dyslexic, they can't attack those words, the nonsense words. So figure out if that's an issue using a nonsense word test. And I actually am going to direct you to one that we offer. It's not standardized, but it is informal, and so you can use it to help guide your instruction. We call it the snapshot informal reading test. So that would be one thing that I would look at, Deborah, to group children. How are they doing on that nonsense word test? That's going to tell me about a sub-skill. It's not a standard so much as the standard would be sound-based decoding, but the sub-skill is the nonsense word test. So another test for even younger kids might be a phoneme segmentation test or a phoneme blending test. For segmenting, can they pull the sounds apart, the individual phonemes apart? So sit is s, it. Can they do that work? And blending, can they put it back together? Can they hear the sounds f, I, sh, and know that it's fish? So those are foundational skills that shore up sound-based decoding, and that will help us know how to group them and then how to teach them. If they are poor at their nonsense word reading of 3 sound words and they don't seem to know some short vowels, then that's what we know now to teach them. If they're poor at their blending of 3 sound words but they can do 4 sound words, then that's what we teach them. And this is where this more sub-skill approach is really helpful. But you don't have to give 1,000 tests. So with this snapshot, we've got 3 simple measures, and these will go a long way. They're not comprehensive. It's not going to tell you everything. It won't solve all your problems. But as a quick triage approach to see where everyone is, get a letter sound knowledge measure, get a phoneme segmentation measure, and get a nonsense word reading measure. So those are the 3 that are here on this snapshot, and we can give you a copy of that. So maybe you will ask your students to tell you these sounds. These are just a selection, not all of the alphabet, but it is a good picture of generally where they stand. And the bottom row, you'd be wanting to look for short vowel sounds. Here are some nonsense words, saf, mott, and then it gets progressively harder. Notice it moves from 3 sounds to 4 sounds, and then to 5 sounds, and then even to words with advanced phonics like flues or paked, and even multisyllable words. So that will give you a lot of information, and here's just how to score it. Over here is the phoneme segmentation test. Sit. What are the sounds in sit? Sally, can you tell me what the sounds are in nap? Just see if she can pull it apart. N-ap. And those 3 measures will help you group your students. They will help you know better what to teach. And so I highly recommend them or something like them. If you already use the Dibbles or Ames Web or some other measure that gets you this type of information, great. And then you take that information and you figure out what to teach, right? Now that's another big question. And if you don't know exactly what to teach, here at Reading Simplified, we have a streamlined approach for that. We know that there are literally thousands of activities you could use to teach blending, segmenting, letter sound knowledge, early decoding. It can be overwhelming. And yet it's not as complicated as we've made it. Here at Reading Simplified, we use really just a small handful of word work activities that hit the nail on the head for most kids who are at the bottom of that triangle in terms of their developmental needs. And we call them, many of you know this, switch it and read it and sort it. Write it is a nice thing to wrap around all of those. But to get started, we usually use those three. And again, if you haven't heard about them, you don't know how to save time, you don't know how to hit a lot of reading sub-skills in just a few short activities, I encourage you to check out our complimentary webinar. We call it 3 activities a day to keep reading difficulties away. So make sure you check that out. But once you get them in groups and you start teaching them activities like switch it and read it, you realize just dynamically what they lack. And so you just fold it into the lesson. That's why that initial information is not so critical. You're not writing up a report about all of their current abilities. You're just getting enough information to triage to get into instruction tomorrow that's really strong. And then the activity itself is actually dynamic. And you look at the end of the day, how do they do? Oh, they actually, most of the time, they recognize the short A sound and the short I sound, but they didn't do well with the short ah, the short O. So we're going to do words tomorrow with short O. So you just fold that into your instructional plan, and the early initial assessment is less important because it just sets you down the path, and on the path you continually readjust. I hope that makes sense. But just to sum up, I want you to reconsider if you need to, if you're open to the idea. Reading levels are helpful, but they're not much more than like a thermometer for a doctor or a temperature. We need more information than that, and we need to get down into the sub-skills that our kids may or may not have, and that will help us to group them for small group instruction, help us to know what to teach. And if we don't know what to teach based on these sub-skills like blending, nonsense word reading, phonemic segmentation, letter sound knowledge. If you don't know what, then I encourage you to check out our 3 activities webinar, 3 activities a day to keep reading difficulties away. Thank you all for being here. We're going to keep going in the next few weeks talking about what are we going to need to do for most of us back to school season, how we're going to get our kids prepared. And last week we talked about relationships, because that's uber important and probably more important now than ever. And now we're thinking more about how to assess and group, and we'll move forward into thinking about what to do in the next stages over the next few weeks. So I hope that we've given you some food for thought. Would you like future complimentary trainings like this here at Reading Simplified? Then make sure you ring the bell here at YouTube to become a subscriber so that you learn more of our ways of streamlining instruction and accelerating students' reading achievement. And you can also find us on Facebook at Reading Simplified, usually on Tuesday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We go live with other complimentary trainings, and we give away some freebies for teachers and parents. So I hope to see you here again next time on YouTube or even on Facebook. Take care.